have finished reading Magnus by George Mackay Brown. My last video on this channel was talking about Vinland by George Mackay Brown, and I said I was going to read Magnus next. It took me a little longer than I thought it would. It's a pretty short book, less than 200 pages, but I don't know, just life stuff. Took me like 2 or 3 weeks, I guess, to read it. When I read the other George Mackay Brown book that I was talking about, I read that in like 5 days, and it's quite a bit longer than this one. But anyways, I am done. I liked it a lot. I think I liked it a little bit better than Finland. So this book is named after and mostly about Magnus Erlendsson, also known as Saint Magnus. He was an Earl of Orkney in the 12th century. He was killed, and I'll get into that. Um, so, if you didn't watch my previous video about Vinland, George Mackay Brown is an author from Orkney. He's also a poet. I think he's more known for his poetry, but I tend to like prose novels written by poets. That's just a niche category that I tend to really enjoy. And this is really good. So Orkney is an archipelago off the northern coast of Scotland. Um, it's been a part of Scotland since the late Middle Ages, but for most of the Middle Ages, it was part of Norway, and it is part of Norway at the time that this book takes place. So, Saint Magnus, I didn't really know a whole lot about Saint Magnus before I read this. I knew he was a saint and an earl from Orkney, and I kind of just assumed it was kind of like a Saint Olaf of Norway or a Saint Patrick of Ireland type of situation where he was sainted because he was part of spreading Christianity to the country and like eliminating paganism. That's not the case though. I just kind of assumed that he was one of those, but Orkney was already pretty completely Christian by the time Magnus came along. Um, it was mostly Christian even in the time period of the last George Mackay Brown book that I read. So that should have been a hint to me. Um, but yeah, kind of funny. His Magnus's grandfather, I think, or great grandfather, I want to say grandfather is a major character in Vinland. Um, but yeah, so he is a saint, and considered a martyr. He was killed by his co-earl. This was something that happened a lot in Orkney in particular, where they would have two earls, like a set of brothers, for example, would both inherit the earldom from their father. um, Magnus, though, was co-earl with his cousin, actually. So what happened was their fathers were twin brothers of the previous earl, twin brothers who were sons of the previous earl. And again, Orkney had a history of letting two or even three brothers rule together, even if they weren't twins or triplets. Um, so obviously, if they are twins, you have to let them both rule. Uh, but then, because neither one of them is older and neither one of them deposed the other at any point, both of their sons end up inheriting the earldom. Um, so the book follows his early life, a little bit, and then most of the book surrounds the events of his death. So there's this contrast in the book that I think is pretty accurate to history of what I've looked up since reading the book between Magnus Erlendsson and Håkon Paulsson. I think it's Håkon Paulsson, not Paul Håkonsson. I hope I'm not mixing that up. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I don't know. I can't. It's yeah. So the two cousins, one of them, Hakon, is very much like the popular image of a Viking. He's very quick to anger, maybe. Would be one of his more negative traits. He's very violent. But also seems like a pretty competent earl. Uh, Whereas Magnus is beloved by the people. He's a devout Christian. He believes strongly in nonviolence, but he's maybe not the best at being an earl. So they end up having a war, as co-earls of Orkney often did throughout the history of Orkney, and that's a big chunk in the middle of the book is kind of uh, not so much the war itself, but what life is like for the farmers on the islands during the war. Um, and then eventually some of Hakon's supporters and some of Magnus's supporters meet together and they're like, this war has to end. And we all kind of agree that Magnus is not a very good earl. Even Magnus's supporters, they love him on a personal level, and they really dislike Hakon on a personal level. But they're like, Magnus is not cut out to be an earl. Maybe we could have some sort of agreement where he could just be exiled and like sent to a monastery and he can be a monk. He would probably like that, and that would be good for everybody. Hakon can be the sole earl. Magnus can just spend the rest of his life in contemplation. So that's the proposal that Magnus's men come up with. Um, and Hakon's men kind of they're down with that and they bring the idea to Hakon and he sort of seems maybe open to the idea, but then he just ends up having his men kill Magnus. I guess that's a spoiler, but I mean these are historical events. If you did a Wikipedia search of Magnus, Saint Magnus, you would get that. So, but what's really interesting about this book is that it's not it's not just going through and depicting those historical events. It's like we're seeing sort of again, like I said, the peasants, the farmers' perspective of what life is like during the war. Um, and there's that quote, I forget who said it, or even I don't even know if it's a famous quote, but it's something people love to say on Twitter that like there can never be a true anti-war movie, right? Because like war movies just are visually cool and they end up, even if they're trying to be anti-war, they accidentally glorify it. Well, this is like genuinely a very anti-war book in that during the war, we don't see any battles. We don't really get the soldiers' perspective at all. We just get a series of anecdotes of these farmers in Orkney and the terrible things that happened to them as a result of the war. Um, very, very sad series of anecdotes, but very powerful. So we get that. And then when it comes to the time of Magnus being killed, the killing itself is not depicted. What we get is like this extended series of comparisons. Um, George Mackay Brown compares the killing of Magnus to like an animal sacrifice and also to a human sacrifice that happened in certain cultures throughout history. And then he also compares it to the death of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Um, that name is not actually used in the book, but that's what he's alluding to, and the name is on like the back of the book, or if you look up criticism of this book, it's a known thing that it's about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a dissident in Nazi Germany. He was a Christian leader. My cat's here. Um, I think he was a priest. I'm gonna look that up as I'm talking, but he was one of the leaders of resistance to Nazism from within Germany, and he ended up getting arrested and executed um, by the Nazis. Yeah, so he was a Lutheran pastor and an anti-Nazi dissident. So, and he was kind of opposing the Nazis on the grounds of like Christian theology and like he believed strongly in nonviolence and like universal love for mankind from a Christian perspective. So there's a comparison between Magnus and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Um, so that's kind of interesting. Uh, and yeah, it's like the first half of the book is like pretty. realistic historical fiction, just depicting various events from Magnus's life and then the lives of farmers in Orkney during the war. And then the second half of the book gets very experimental with the way that we shift between different characters' perspectives and shift between different time periods. There's a passage where he's still talking about Magnus, not talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer yet, but he's narrating it as if it's like a newscast, and there's like modern technology mentioned, but he's still talking about Magnus. It's really interesting. And then so another thing I wanted to point out, I'm kind of all over the place here, but I bookmarked a couple of passages. There's this image of a coat. So um, one of during one of the anecdotes from the lives of the farmers during the war, we have this peasant farmer named Mans, and he is comparing like the Society of Orkney to a coat, and this one's pretty short, so I'm just gonna read it. Let me find exactly where it starts. Okay, yeah. So this is him talking to his wife, and he's comparing the Society of Orkney to this coat and talking about what happens to it during war. So he says, Prem and me, he said, we were speaking about it last night. I was up at Prem's, if you remember. Well, I did have a pint. I'll tell you what I said to Prem. He had set up his loom and he was stretching a warp. Prem, I said, we're one folk. We all hang together. We're all of a piece. Priest, plowman, laird, tinker, earl, we're all woven together in a kind of a coat. Now the coat's in tatters and Orkney's naked, I said. That's what war means in the end. Everyone trying to cover himself from the east wind with his own bit of rag. So we have that, and then like 10 or 15 pages later, we have Bishop William of Orkney, and I'm not going to read this one verbatim because it's a couple pages long, but he is also creating this image of a coat. Um, so yeah, he's sitting at his table. He's writing a homily called "Concerning the Two Coats of Caesar and of God that Cover Adam's Shame." So there's two coats that cover Adam's shame, and one of them is the coat of Caesar, and one is the coat of God. So the bulk of this is him talking about Caesar's coat, and he's talking about how it's beautiful and it's made of all these valuable materials, and all the people from different backgrounds and different occupations contribute what they have to the making of this coat. Um, but it's stiff and uncomfortable, and the monarch can only actually wear it for a small period of time, and then yeah, so he's talking about all the things that go into making it, and he says, but conversely, when men of the same community act with malice and pride towards one another, then it may be said that the fabric is endangered. Here and there threads must always be working loose. So again, very similar to what this farmer was talking about, that it's like this coat is getting torn apart when Orkney is at war. And then he's about to start talking about how there's a different coat that the monarch can wear, which is the coat of God, and then he gets cut off by visitors coming in. Um, and those visitors end up being Hakon's men and Magnus's men who had come up with this plan. They don't talk about the plan yet in this part of the book, but they're the people who end up talking about this plan for peace that gets subverted when Hakon just decides to kill Magnus instead. So a lot of really interesting stuff going on in this. I think probably a lot of the same ideas are in Vinland, but this book compared to Vinland is a little more overtly philosophical. It's more experimental in its structure by a lot. And I'll also say I liked the prose a little bit better in this one. Um, I think Vinland, the prose is pretty plain, and it's very pretty, as you would expect from somebody who's more known for poetry, but it's fairly simple. This one, I think, is like a little bit more elevated and feels even more so like a novel written by somebody who's mostly a poet. Um, so I think that's most of what I had to say about this. Really interesting ideas and really interesting ways of presenting them, all against this backdrop of medieval Orkney, which I have grown very fond of. Although I think George Mackay Brown's other novels that I'm going to be reading at some point soon are, uh, I know one of them is contemporary, and then one of them is another historical fiction, but I don't think it's quite the same time period as this. So we'll check those out. Um, yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say. I really liked this. This is like immediately one of my favorite books of all time. Um, Not like the favorite, but if I were to make like a top 25 list, this is on it for sure. It might even be top 10. So really good. I'm gonna read more George McKay Brown soon.